G'day folks, John from Outdoor Academy, and today I'm going to show you how to make a lasso using 3 knots. We're going to use a Matthew Walker knot for a stopper knot on our Honda knot. And at the other end, I may even make it a sliding adjustable horn loop to put onto your saddle. Stay tuned. Let's just go over some of the things we're going to need. Obviously we're going to need a rope. This one was retired from the rodeo circuit. Not sure if it's nylon or polyester. The other thing we're going to need is a little bit of electrical tape. That's just to bind up the ends so that it doesn't fray. A pair of pliers. You're going to need some sort of heat source like a heat gun like this one, or you can use a blowtorch. Just be careful that you don't melt your rope. Because it's such a stiff rope, we want to loosen up the fibres with a little bit of heat. To make the horn loop for the end, we're going to need to be able to feed some strands through another knot. It'll pay to have a marlin spike. If you don't have one, do what I did and just sharpen a stick to a nice long point. I think I'm going to add a burner onto the end of my Honda knot. So I've got a little bit of leather and some leather working gear to be able to punch some holes and stitch it together. And of course we're going to need some sort of cutting tool. I'm using my BPS bushcraft knife. It's razor sharp, and I'm going to do a video next on how to sharpen these. If that's something that you're interested in, subscribe and hit the notification bell. So first we need to get this rope back to a blank canvas. Now some of these ropes have lead infills to add a bit of weight to them. I don't want to ruin my knife right off the get-go, so to get rid of these knots I'm just going to use a pair of shears. As soon as I remove that, I want to straight away add some electrical tape to each of those strands so that they don't fray. One way you can often undo a stubborn knot is to give it a hit. Once we've broken the back of that knot, we might be able to have a chance of getting it out and saving ourselves a little bit of rope. There we go. That Honda knot didn't have a stopper knot in it after all. It looks like it was just melted and pushed into the end. I think I could improve on that. So first up, we're going to be tying the Matthew Walker stopper knot in the end of a rope. Here's how we tie it. So we start off by unravelling about 5 or 6 inches of the rope. If we take a quick look at the rope is twisting this way. When I tie this knot, we're going to tie a series of overhand knots in these strands. But the way I need to tie it is this one first, then this one last. We won't be doing it 1, 2, 3. We'll tie it 1, 2, 3, if that makes sense. So I'm going to start with this left hand strand. I'm going to lay it down past where the twists are here, and I'm just going to tie an overhand knot in that, like that. Now I'm going to come to this one. I'm going to lay it down in front and put an overhand knot in that, coming through both those strands. And then with the third piece of rope, I'm going to lay that down also, and the same thing, overhand knot through all 3 strands this time. And now we've got to dress it all down. This is where your pliers come in. We want to dress the knot so that all 3 strands are running parallel to each other. Once you've got it looking nice and neat, then we're going to start pulling everything down tight. So when you're done, you want a nice, neat twist on the rope. Now we're just going to nip and melt these ends. As I cut these strands, I just want to leave a little bit of room there to give it something to melt. And that's your Matthew Walker stopper knot. Now before I tie the Honda knot, I've got to take care of this end of the rope because I need to be able to feed this through the small loop that I'm making for the saddle horn. So what I've done is I've come down about a foot, and I'm going to unravel that to give me some rope to work with. You're better off having more than not enough. So I'll just come down a little bit more. So when I've taped that off, I've just left a little tag on the end. That'll make it easy to pull the tape off and find the end of it when it's time to come undone. So the first knot that I need to tie for this loop is a Turk's head. Here's how we tie that. So to tie the Turk's head, I'm going to create a loop on that right hand strand. Then with the center strand, I'm going to come through and over the top of that loop. And now with this right hand strand, I'm going to come over the top. And then with this left hand strand, I'm going to come over the top and back through that loop. And as I pull that tight, each strand individually, we'll end up with a bit of a square or a triangle in there. Now I don't want to make this one too tight initially because I'm going to have to feed strands back in through here. But it should look like that. Now what I want to do is take each of these strands and I'm going to come over the top of there, and you'll see where it forms an X in the rope. And I'm going to feed each of those strands back up through the middle and out through the center. One, over the top of that strand and through that X. And the same with this third one. This is where having a marlin spike is going to come in handy. Make yourself a bit of a gap. Poke that up through there. Now we want to dress that all down. We don't want that too tight just yet because we want to be able to feed these strands back down through the knot. So the next thing I want to do, because we want our loop to come around our rope, is I'm going to plait some of these sections, but just enough to go around the rope and back down through that knot. So I probably need to braid about 1 inch or 2 there. Just a simple over the top with the left, over the top with the right. And that'll give us a nice flat braid. That should be more than enough there. Do a bit of a test fit. And I think that'll do us. I'll just use a little bit of tape. You can use a clip. I'll use a little bit of tape just to hold that braid in place. And leave myself a little bit of a tag so I know where to untie it. This is where our handy marlin spike comes back in. So you can see I'm just going to create a gap back down through that knot. Take one of our strands and feed that back down through into there. I'm not going to feed it all the way through because I want to be able to get the other end of the rope back through down into there. It's going to be pretty snug, but that means it's not going to come undone. Alright, so before we tighten that down, let's remove this bit of tape. You want it to be snug but still moving fairly freely. All that's left to do now is another crown knot on the end. And it's exactly the same process as before. We're going to form a loop. This one's going to go through that loop and over the top. Then this one's going to go over the top and around our part of the rope, and then through that. And you'll see the rope passes through the triangle in the middle and everything's locked in place. Now the same as before, we're going to find the X and come up through that X. Now we're going to get the pliers out and tighten them down. Now we're just going to nip and melt these ends. Just hold the flame slightly away from the rope because we don't want to melt this rope. I'll just pound that a little bit to get it all into shape. So there we go, we've got a horn loop for our rope. Let's take a look at how to tie the Honda knot. Alright, so it's important once you've coiled your rope, because every rope has its own memory and how it wants to coil. It's how it come off the spool originally, more than likely. We want to tie the first part of this Honda knot so that it's parallel with the rest of the rope. So we're going to come up on the right hand side, and I'll show you this first person view in a sec, and just tie an overhand knot in your rope, just like that. Now as that's sitting parallel to your rope, to tie the Honda knot we basically push down this section of rope, come around at 90 degrees and back through that part of the rope, and then we can dress everything down. And before we set the rope, we want to make sure that this loop sits at 90 degrees to the rope. Let me tie that again for you in first person view. So we're going to come around the rope on the right hand side and then back through the rope to form a simple overhand knot. Now depending on the size of your loop that you want to make will depend on how long this tail section is. Now we're going to come across at 90 degrees to that knot. We're going to push that down with our thumb, come through that top section of the loop. Now by pulling on this section and the standing part of your rope, that'll tighten everything down. And once you coil your rope, you want the knot to be 90 degrees so that it runs freely through the loop. So all I've made here is a simple contraption with a piece of timber that I can stand on, and I can hook that loop around the carabiner, pull up on it to help me set that knot. Let's see how that works. So I'm just going to wrap the rope around my hips, use my hips to stand up and pull tight on that knot, and there we've got our Honda knot. So for this step you can use a bit of leather or you can use a bit of rawhide. All I need to do from here is cut out a rectangle initially, and just measure that against the rope. Something about that size, I don't know, maybe 2 inches long, and depending on the diameter of your rope, thick enough to almost go around it. And I'm just going to cut off the corners just to make it more biscuit shaped. I'm going to pop that into a jar of warm water just to soften the material a little bit. While I'm waiting for the leather to soften up, I might just thread my needle with this wax thread. I'm going to need my glasses for this one. And a nice big figure 8 knot in the end of that. I'm just going to take my awl and I'm going to put 3 holes, one in the center and one either side of the center of that biscuit. And we're going to try and center that biscuit. While the leather is wet, it's going to be nice and pliable, and you can shape it to the rope. I think in leathercraft they call that wet forming. And you can see it almost goes all the way around. Once your burner is centered in the middle of your loop, we're going to start by coming through the back. That'll hide that stopper knot. I'll just tuck that tag end in there. Over the top and back through both those loops. We don't want to go too tight just yet. Because now we're going to come back through the front in at a 45-degree angle. And now we can pull that first one tight. Now back in through the back of that middle loop, that middle hole I should say. Over the top and through both. Back through the front and in at that 45 degrees. Now we can pull that one tight. In through the back. In through both. Now that shouldn't go anywhere. And to finish this off, I'm going to go back underneath all of these stitches. Finish the stitch off, we're going to come back through that last stitch. And we're just going to do 2 or 3 wraps around the needle. Pull it through, and then it'll give us a double overhand knot to lock it off. And just nip and melt your ends. Job done. So the final step's going to be to feed your rope through the bottom of your loop. Recoil it and we'll go and try it out. So I'm just a simple outdoorsman. I'm no cowboy. But for those of you that spend long days in the hot sun putting food on my table, thanks for your service. I hope this video has been useful to you. Every tradesman should know their tools. Thanks for watching.